Everett Malone said the words at the hospital. Not at home, not in private, not in the kind of quiet room where hard things are supposed to be said. He said them in the hallway outside the ICU, while the machines behind the door were still beeping for Willa's mother, while the smell of antiseptic sat in the air like a held breath, while Willa Drace Malone, the 36-year-old wife of Everett and silent controlling partner of Drace Capital Group, still had her mother's bracelet pressed between both palms because she had nothing else to hold. He said, "I have been waiting for the right time, and there is no right time, so I am saying it now. I want out." Beside him stood Cameron Voss, the 29-year-old brand consultant hired 8 months earlier for Drace Capital's new public-facing investment fund. She was not touching him. She did not need to. The way she stood said everything a hand on his arm would have said. Willa looked at her husband, then at the woman next to him, then back at the door where her mother was still alive, barely inside a room that smelled like machinery and borrowed time. She said nothing. Everett took that silence as permission. What he did not know, what he had never bothered to find out, was that the fund Cameron had been hired to represent, the fund Everett believed he was about to lead into its most visible season, was not his. It had never been his. Drace Capital Group was built by Willa's parents, protected by Willa's attorneys, controlled through a private holding structure that had no public name and no executive signature anyone outside a sealed legal circle could read, by Willa herself. Everett Malone was the face of a company his wife owned, and he was standing in a hospital hallway telling her he was done. "The badge clipped to Willa's coat," said strategic advisor. That was what it had said for 6 years. She had designed the title herself, the same way her mother had designed the original Drace Capital letterhead, careful and understated, built to let the work speak before the name did. People inside the building called her Everett's wife. People at Gallus introduced her as his +1. People in meetings occasionally forgot she was in the room. That was not an accident. Willa's mother, Harriet Drace, had started the firm from a rented office and 2 client accounts when Willa was 11. Her father, Owen, had handled the legal architecture from the beginning, building the holding structure in layers the way you build a wall, quietly, 1 brick at a time, so no one noticed until it was already standing. By the time Willa was 26, both of her parents had signed the beneficial control to her through a trust vehicle no financial magazine had ever correctly identified. The public records showed an entity called Aldenmere Holdings. Aldenmere's controlling interest was Willa Drace. Drace Capital's controlling entity was Aldenmere. Everett knew about her family's firm. He had simply never cared enough to understand what that meant. He was a charming man who believed charm was the same thing as competence. In the early years, that had not felt like a flaw. It had felt like energy, like forward motion, like the kind of confidence that filled rooms and made investors lean in. Willa had loved that version of him. She had loved the way he told stories, the way he shook hands like he already trusted the person, the way he looked at her across dinner tables like she was the best decision he had ever made. She did not know exactly when he stopped looking at her that way. She only knew that at some point the dinners became meetings he forgot to mention, and the weekends became trips that overlapped with Cameron's consulting schedule, and the look across tables became a look through her, past her, at whatever room he wanted to be in next. Tilda Pratt, the 58-year-old executive director of Aldenmere Holdings and one of 3 people on Earth who understood the full scope of Willa's position, had warned her 14 months earlier. Not about Cameron specifically, about the pattern. Tilda had sat across from Willa in the same quiet conference room where Willa's father used to review contracts, and said gently, but without softening it, that a man who stops asking questions about the company is either disengaged or planning an exit. Willa had said she would handle it. She had not handled it. She had believed in the version of Everett she had married, and that belief had kept her from seeing the version he had become. The day of her mother's stroke, Willa had been inside a silent board review at Drace Capital when her phone vibrated once on the table in front of her. She looked down. Hospital. She stood up without explanation. No one questioned it. She drove to the hospital with her hands perfectly steady on the wheel because she had learned from her mother that the time to fall apart was never when someone needed you present. She sat beside Harriet's bed for 4 hours before Everett arrived. He came in smelling faintly of a restaurant Willa did not recognize, which meant he had not come from the office. His tie was singed in the way that looked deliberate. He stood in the doorway of Harriet's room and said, "I got here as fast as I could." Harriet's eyes were closed. She could not hear him. Willa looked at her husband across the hospital bed and said nothing, because the things she wanted to say were the kind that could not be unsaid. He stayed 40 minutes. Then his phone buzzed and he said he had a call. He could not move. He left. Willa stayed. 3 days later, Harriet stabilized. The doctors said there was time, which was the most they would promise. Willa sat in the small waiting area outside the ICU drinking coffee that tasted like cardboard and answering emails she could not defer, and that was when Everett arrived with Cameron behind him and said the words in the hallway. Willa looked at the divorce papers he was holding. Not a letter, not an explanation. Papers, prepared in advance, dated 4 days earlier, which meant he had signed them the same afternoon Harriet had her stroke. She said, "You chose today." Everett's jaw tightened. "I have been trying to find a way to say this for months." Willa looked past him at Cameron, who had the expression of a woman waiting to be introduced. She looked back at her husband. "I have to go back inside," Willa said. "My mother is awake." Everett blinked. He had expected something else. Crying, maybe, or a raised voice, or the kind of scene that would make the decision look justified. What he got was a woman turning away from him and walking back through the ICU door. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he and Cameron left. Willa sat beside her mother's bed and held Harriet's hand and did not say a word about what had just happened in the hall. Harriet was awake but fragile, her eyes moving slowly around the room the way eyes do when the brain is still deciding what is real. She looked at Willa and said quietly, "Where is Everett?" Willa said, "He had to step out. He sends his love." Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Her mother had never liked Everett the way she liked Owen. She had supported the marriage because Willa loved him and because Harriet Drace believed in honoring the choices of people you trusted. But she had said once, early on, in the car after a dinner where Everett had talked over Willa 3 times and not noticed, she had said, "Make sure he knows what you are, Willa. Men who do not know what they are standing beside do not know how to protect it." Willa had not told him. Not later, not ever. She held her mother's hand and watched her fall back to sleep. That night in the parking garage, she called Tilda. Tilda picked up before the second ring. She always did, in the way of people who had been waiting for a call without knowing exactly when it would come. Willa said, "He filed. He did it 4 days ago." There was a pause. Then Tilda said, "Where are you?" "Hospital parking. 3rd level. I will be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 17. They sat in Tilda's car with the engine running for warmth, and Willa told her what had happened in the hallway. The papers, Cameron's presence, the date on the filing. Tilda listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Willa had always valued about her. When Willa finished, Tilda said, "You know what this means for his access?" Willa said, "Yes, his executive credentials are tied to a vendor contract," Tilda said. "Not a partnership agreement, not an equity position. He has been operating as a contracted face for the public fund. The separation of assets under the prenuptial agreement is complete." Willa already knew this. Owen had built the prenuptial agreement himself before he passed, at a time when Everett had declined to review it with independent counsel and signed it the way people sign things they assume will never matter. "What does he think he is leaving with?" Tilda asked. "His salary," Willa said. "His reputation. The fund he believes he built." Tilda was quiet for a moment, then she said, "And what does he actually leave with?" "A signed vendor termination," Willa said, "if the board authorizes it." Tilda looked at her carefully. "There is something else. Nolan called me this afternoon." Nolan Vale, the 44-year-old head of internal compliance at Drace Capital, was the kind of person whose calls meant something had moved that was not supposed to move. Willa said, "Tell me." Everett's credentials were used to grant Cameron back-end access to the public fund's investor presentation files. She has been reviewing confidential materials, client projections, and the upcoming conference strategy since last month. The access was not flagged because it came through Everett's login, but Nolan caught it on the audit trail. Willa looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking level. "He gave her the roadmap," Willa said. Tilda nodded. "For the Aldenmere annual conference, the one in 6 weeks, the one Everett is supposed to headline." Willa said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Do not touch the access yet. Do not flag it. Let me think." Tilda looked at her the way Tilda always looked at her when she was deciding something large. Not with doubt, with the kind of patience that comes from having watched someone make good decisions before. Willa pressed her hand flat against the car door, steadying herself. "Do not move anything until I say." The next morning, Willa walked into Drace Capital through the side entrance, the way she always did. The lobby was quiet at 7:15. The receptionist looked up, registered her, and looked back down. People rarely thought about her arrival. That had always suited her. She took the elevator to the 4th floor, which was where the compliance and trust records were kept, and where Nolan's office sat at the end of a hallway that most of the building did not have reason to visit. She knocked once. He was already there. Nolan Vale was a careful man. Not cold but precise, the kind of person who felt more comfortable with documentation than with interpretation. He had been at Drace Capital for 11 years and had known from the beginning, in the way that people in compliance tend to know things, that the quiet woman with the strategic advisor badge was not what her badge said she was. He had never asked. She had never confirmed. That was part of why she trusted him. He slid a printed audit log across the desk without preamble. Willa sat down and read it. Cameron Voss had accessed the fund's internal infrastructure 17 times over 5 weeks. She had downloaded the full investor contact list, the Q3 performance deck, the preliminary agenda for the annual conference, and a private memo outlining the 3 institutional clients Drace Capital was planning to approach in the spring. Willa set the papers down. She asked, "Is this enough to support a formal access review?" Nolan said, "With Everett's cooperation on the credential, it would look like an internal administrative error. Without his cooperation, it becomes unauthorized access to proprietary investment materials." Willa looked at the date on the first download. The day after Harriet's stroke, she asked, "Did he know what she was taking?" Nolan was quiet. Then he said the credential was used from 2 different devices. One is his company laptop. One is a personal tablet registered to Cameron's Consulting LLC. Willa absorbed this. "He set it up for her," she said. Nolan did not answer, which was itself an answer. Over the following 2 weeks, Willa did not change her routine. She came through the side entrance. She sat in the quiet conference room. She signed the papers that needed to be signed. She ate lunch alone at the small table in the archival office and read documents that looked like old client histories, but were, in fact, the complete paper trail of every decision Everett had approved, every expense he had authorized, every access he had extended, and every public claim he had made about building what he had not built. The picture that formed was not surprising. It was just complete. Everett had been positioning himself for a public departure. Not a termination, not a scandal, a career pivot. He had told at least 3 industry contacts, in language that Nolan had recovered from company correspondence, that he was in the process of separating from a private family firm that had held him back and moving toward an independent platform. He had implied, in terms careful enough to be deniable, that the fund's intellectual architecture was his. Cameron's LLC had already incorporated a new advisory entity. Willa sat with that information the way you sit with something heavy, without setting it down, without letting it pull you to the floor. There was also a younger name in the files. Bennett Ashwood, the 27-year-old junior analyst, whose research methodology had formed the backbone of Drace Capital's emerging market strategy for the past 3 years. Bennett had developed the model during a fellowship program that the firm had funded. He had presented it first to Everett, who had praised it privately, and then presented it publicly as a collaborative framework without crediting Bennett's name. Willa had not known about this. She called Bennett's extension from the archival office. He came down 10 minutes later, a young man with the careful posture of someone who had learned not to take up too much room. He stood in the doorway like he was deciding whether entering was safe. Willa said, "Sit down, please." He sat. She said, "I want to talk to you about the emerging markets model." Something moved across his face. Not anger. The thing that comes after anger when you have had it too long and it has turned into something quieter and harder to name. He said, "Everett said it was a team contribution." Willa said, "Was it?" Bennett looked at the table. His hands were still on his knees. He said, "I built it. I have the original files, version 1 through 14. I have the fellowship submission from before I ever came to Drace." Willa said, "Did anyone ask you not to raise this?" He looked at her for a moment, then looked down again. Sands, the 38-year-old senior fund manager and closest professional ally of Everett, told me that making noise about internal contributions was a good way to lose visibility in the industry. Willa touched the papers in front of her but did not move them. She said, "I want you to bring me those files, all 14 versions." Bennett looked at her the way Oren had looked at Selene. Not yet understanding the full weight of the room he was sitting in, but understanding something had shifted. She said, "Your work is going to be credited correctly. That is not a promise I make lightly." He nodded once. It was not fearless. It was the better thing. The Aldenmere annual conference was held each year in a private ballroom at a financial institution whose name was engraved in stone above its entrance. It was an invitation-only event. Institutional clients, board members, strategic partners, press from 2 financial publications, and the executive team of Drace Capital filled the room with the specific kind of energy that money makes when it is organized and being watched. Everett had headlined it for 4 consecutive years. This year he arrived in a car he had charged to the company account, with Cameron in the seat beside him and the kind of settled certainty on his face that men wear when they believe the ground beneath them is permanent. He did not see Willa until he was inside. She was standing near the side wall with Tilda, Nolan, and a woman Everett did not recognize, Pruitt Calloway, the 61-year-old outside counsel who had represented the Drace family trust since Owen's time. Pruitt was small and white-haired and had the specific stillness of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms where things were decided. Everett crossed the room toward Willa, his voice lowered to the register people use when they want to manage a situation before it becomes visible. He said, "I did not expect you here," Willa said. "I would not miss it." He said, "This is not the place." She said, "You said something similar to me in a hospital hallway." His jaw moved. He glanced at Cameron, who had followed him, and was now standing slightly behind his right shoulder in the way that had become habitual. Willa looked at Cameron for a moment. Then she said, "The access you gave her to the fund's proprietary materials has been flagged under our compliance protocol. Outside counsel has been notified. You will both receive formal letters before the end of the day." Cameron's expression did not collapse. It arranged itself carefully, which was somehow worse. Everett said, "That is company access I authorized." Willa said, "You authorized it using credentials that exist because I extended them to you." "There is a difference between access and ownership, Everett. You have spent 6 years not learning it." He stared at her. Kira Sands appeared at his elbow, reading the room, moving to manage it. She was a skilled woman who had chosen the wrong alliance. She said smoothly, "Perhaps we step outside before the program begins." Nolan, standing 3 feet away, looked at Willa once. She gave the smallest nod. He reached into his jacket and handed Kira a sealed envelope. Legal notice. Her name was on the front. Kira looked at the envelope. Her smooth expression did not change, but her hands went still. The program began. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The Aldenmere Holdings seal appeared on the large screen at the front of the room, the way it did every year, opening the formal program. Everett moved toward the front, toward the podium that had his name in the printed program, toward the audience of investors and partners and press, who had come to hear the man they believed had built this. The seal remained on the screen for 3 seconds longer than usual. Then it dissolved into a title that no one in the room had been expecting. Aldenmere Holdings Compliance Disclosure Annual Conference. The murmuring began. Everett stopped walking. The first slide appeared without narration, without music, without preamble. A clean white document on a dark screen. An access log. 17 entries. Dates, timestamps, file names. Lecklist the Q3 deck. The Spring Outreach memo. Each download marked with a device identifier registered to Cameron Voss Consulting LLC. Cameron sat very still in the third row. The second slide appeared. Expense records. A private dinner charged to client hospitality. A hotel stay listed under conference preparation. A business travel claim for 2 on a trip that had no client meeting attached to it. The third slide. Recovered internal correspondence. Everett's language to 3 separate industry contacts, describing his plan to build an independent platform using the strategic framework he had developed at his current firm. The framework he had not developed. The fourth slide. Bennett Ashwood's name above a methodology document dated 3 years and 4 months earlier. Beside it, a time-stamped fellowship submission, pre-employment unmistakably original. Beside that, the Drace Capital public presentation, where the framework had appeared under a different attribution. Somewhere near the back, Bennett sat with both hands flat on his knees. Kira rose from her seat. "This is inappropriate for a client-facing event." Pruitt Calloway, from her position near the side wall, said quietly but clearly, "This presentation has been authorized by the controlling ownership of Aldenmere Holdings and reviewed by outside legal counsel. Every record shown is preserved under compliance hold." Kira sat back down. Everett turned from the screen toward Willa. His face had the specific expression of a man who has been in a room he thought he owned and is only now seeing the floor plan correctly. He said, "What is this?" It was not a question. Willa stepped forward from the side wall. She did not rush. She had not rushed once in the past 6 weeks, and she was not going to start now. She walked to the front of the room the way her mother walked into difficult meetings, without apology, without performance, just presence. She stood beside Bennett Ashwood. She said, "Drace Capital Group and Aldenmere Holdings are initiating formal review of the following matters: unauthorized access to proprietary investment materials, misrepresentation of creative and intellectual contributions, misuse of company expense authorizations, undisclosed conflicts of interest in vendor relationships." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Effective immediately," she continued. "The following individuals are placed on administrative suspension pending investigation: Everett Malone, Cameron Voss, and Kira Sands. Vendor contracts are suspended. Credential access is terminated. Outside counsel will contact each party within 48 hours. Everett took a step toward her. "You own this," he said. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Willa looked at him directly. She had been looking at him for 11 years, and she had not always seen him clearly. She saw him clearly now. She said, "You simply never asked what you were standing beside." The words landed without drama. "That was what made them land so hard." Cameron stood. "I was told she was a silent partner." Willa turned her eyes to her. A silent partner, she said, is still a partner. The room did not erupt. Financial rooms rarely do. They went very quiet, which is its own kind of eruption, the kind where the sound travels farther and lasts longer. Pruitt moved to the podium and made a brief statement about the compliance review process, the preservation of client records, and the continuation of the conference under Aldenmere Holdings' direct oversight. She was efficient and unhurried, and spoke with the authority of a woman who had been in harder rooms than this. Tilda stood near the back and watched the board members, the investors, the press. She made notes on the tablet she always carried. She was already thinking about the next 48 hours, the client communications that would need to go out, the press statement that would need to be calibrated. The transition of Everett's visible role to a structure that had always existed underneath it. Nolan distributed sealed envelopes to Everett, Cameron, and Kira. Each one contained the formal notice, the access termination, and the outside counsel contact. Each person took their envelope with the careful movements of someone trying to appear composed. Everett held his in both hands and looked at it like it was something he could not yet read. Then he looked at Willa again. He said, "We could have talked about this." Willa said, "I tried to. In a hospital hallway, while my mother was inside a room full of machines, you handed me papers you had signed the same day she had a stroke. You did not want to talk. You wanted to leave." He flinched. "You are leaving," she said. "This is just the part where the building knows it too." She turned back to Bennett. She said, "Bennett Ashwood's emerging markets methodology will be formally credited in all Drace Capital materials effective immediately. His contribution will be acknowledged at the next public presentation and reflected in his compensation review. The firm owes him that, and more, and we will begin correcting it today." Bennett covered his mouth with one hand. It was a small gesture, quick, but the people nearest to him saw it. One person began to clap, then another. Not applause, the way audiences applaud a performance, but the quieter sound of people who understand that something true just happened in a room where true things were not always welcome. In the weeks that followed, things moved the way formal things move when the structure beneath them was built correctly from the beginning. Everett's separation from Drace Capital was processed through outside counsel. Cameron's consulting contract was terminated. The unauthorized access to proprietary materials became a civil matter with documentation that was difficult to argue against. Kira resigned before the board vote was finalized. Everett made 2 attempts to reach Willa by phone. She did not answer. The third attempt came through a mutual acquaintance who said that Everett wanted to understand what he had missed. Willa asked Tilda to respond on her behalf with a single sentence, "The records speak for themselves." The emerging markets methodology was formally recredited to Bennett Ashwood in a client memo that went out to every institutional investor on the Drace Capital list. 3 of them wrote back to say they were glad the firm had done it. One wrote to say it reminded him why he had trusted Drace Capital in the first place. Bennett came to Willa's office the day after the memo went out. He stood in the doorway again, the same careful posture, but something in his face was different. The held quality was gone. "Thank you," Willa said. "Your work was always yours. We are just finally saying so out loud." He looked at the framed photograph on the credenza behind her desk, a picture of Harriet and Owen standing outside the original Drace Capital office, young and serious, and clearly in the middle of building something. He said, "Are those your parents?" "Yes," Willa said. He looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he said, "They made something good." Willa looked at the photograph too. "I know," she said. "Harriet was moved out of the ICU 6 weeks after the stroke. She came home slowly with a cane and a schedule of appointments that filled a paper calendar. Willa kept on the kitchen counter. She tired easily. She asked about the firm in the careful way of someone who wanted to know but did not want to be a burden. One afternoon, Willa sat beside her on the porch with 2 cups of tea that had gone cold, and she told her mother everything. Not as a report, as the conversation she had been waiting to have. Harriet listened without interrupting. When Willa finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "Did you use the side entrance or the front when you went in that morning?" Willa said the side. Harriet nodded slowly. "Use the front next time." It was the most Owen thing Harriet had ever said, and Willa felt it the way you feel something that belongs to the past arriving quietly in the present. A month later, she walked through the front entrance of Drace Capital for the first time. The receptionist looked up. A few people in the lobby registered the change without knowing why it felt like one. She crossed the marble floor beneath the company name and pressed the elevator button for the executive floor. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. She touched her mother's bracelet on her wrist, the one she had been holding in the hospital hallway the day Everett chose to leave. She thought of him standing there with the papers, looking at her, like she was something he had already gotten past. She thought of Bennett sitting across from her at that small table, hands on his knees, trying to decide if it was safe to tell the truth. She thought of her mother saying, "Make sure he knows what you are standing beside." She had not told Everett. She understood now that she had done that wrong. Not because he deserved to know, but because silence, held for the wrong reasons, could become its own kind of erasure. She knew how to be quiet for the right reasons now. The elevator opened. She stepped into the executive hallway. Down the corridor, through the glass wall, she could see the conference room where Bennett was presenting the updated fund framework to two of their largest clients. He was standing at the screen with the easy posture of someone who no longer felt like a guest. She did not go in. She watched from the hallway for a moment, just long enough to see what the room looked like when it was holding the right things. Then she walked to her office, sat down at her desk, and opened the first of 12 documents waiting for her signature. Some women go quiet because they have nothing to say. Willa Drace had been quiet because she was listening. There is a difference, and the people who never bother to learn it are the ones who end up standing in a hallway, holding papers that mean nothing, outside a building they never understood.